Otherwise, I'll intensify.
Oh, maybe this. It's okay. I was told 25 to 30 seconds.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so I'm going to talk about choice today, going in a little bit of a different direction from what Rebecca did, but I think you'll see lots of intersections, so it could be good for the discussion. So why is it important to talk about choice? Why is the study of choice important for those of us interested in contemporary parenting and family issues? I think it's important for a number of reasons. First of all, choice is what sets the parameters of possibility for parenting and child care, right? The context of choice is what delineates what options and alternatives are considered acceptable for parents to consider. And it's also what sets the guidelines for assessing the relative value or merit of those various possibilities. Thirdly, choice, of course, influences the process of decision making. And equally as important, the context of choice shapes how those decisions are judged and evaluated by mothers themselves as well as by others. So the context of choice very much shapes how mothers and others feel about mothers' decisions and experiences, which also in turn affect mothers' own perceptions of how they are being surveyed by the world around them, and therefore how they interact and talk with others about those experiences and decisions. Now in my work I refer to the concept of choice as a specific environment within which particular mothering and parenting decisions are made. So I'm treating the concept of choice more as a noun than a verb because I'm deliberately trying to separate it from the activity of decision making. I think all too often we tend to use the term choice both when we're talking about the having of choices as well as the making of choices. And sometimes that ends up confounding what I think are two analytically distinct concepts. So my argument then is for a conceptualization of choice which refers specifically to that context that actually defines what the options or alternatives are for any particular parenting issue, and that delineates how those options are to be interpreted, weighed, assessed, contextualized. So the specific research I'm going to talk about today was an historical content analysis of the infant feeding portions of Dr. Spock's famous manual, Baby and Child Care. So I looked at 4 editions of the manual. The first edition published in 1946, the third edition published in 1968, the 6th edition published in 1992, and the final, most recent edition published in 1998. Now, Dr. Spock and the expert advice industry more generally is part of a community of moral entrepreneurs of contemporary child care, and we've talked about this a lot today already. So as we are well aware, their voices play a big part in the construction of knowledge about child rearing and mothering. And in that same context, given their privileged status as moral entrepreneurs, the expert advice industry must also be understood as playing a key role in the actual creation and shaping of choice as it pertains to parenting and child care. So my position here is that choice is not only shaped through very real social, structural, and material forces, like, for example, changes in public policy, changes in the law, people's economic situations, and day-to-day realities, but choice is also shaped through text, as well as through other forms of social interactions and relations. So my analysis revealed a number of things about how the text has changed over time in relation to how it positions the issue of infant feeding and how it specifically advises mothers about infant feeding. And today I'm not going to go through all of those changes per se. My interest more is to talk about how these changes have actually shaped the context of choice in infant feeding and how that has changed over recent decades. So I'm going to talk about this in relation to 3 concepts that I think are quite central to the study of choice and to better understanding the mechanisms of choice. These concepts, keeping in mind that they're still a bit rough in their formulation, so the terminology might not be right, but they're the dimensions of comparability, freedom, and morality. Okay. So the first dimension of choice, which of comparability, is about understanding how different alternatives stack up against one another, right? How they're established as choices in relation to one another and also in relation to other non-acceptable choices. So the premise here is in order to have a choice about something, there's got to be something to choose between, right? There's got to be two or more alternatives that are actually presented for consideration. And in order for these alternatives to be presented or considered in the realm of acceptable choice, there's got to be some kind of comparability dialogue that actually positions them as choices. So in infant feeding discourse, this feature of comparability can be examined by looking at how breastfeeding and formula feeding are described in relation to one another, and also in relation to other non-acceptable choices. And what my analysis of Dr. Spock's manual revealed is that this notion of comparability has shifted dramatically over the years, to the point where the very idea of comparability as a prerequisite of choice has virtually collapsed. Now, breastfeeding has always been advocated by Dr. Spock as the preferred method of feeding. Formula feeding's always been kind of the second best or the alternative. However, what's happened is the discursive gap between these two choices has widened incredibly, by formula feeding becoming increasingly devalued discursively, and by breastfeeding becoming ever more lauded. And I'll just give you an example of how formula feeding specifically has become increasingly devalued. Yeah, okay. So in 1946, the original version of the manual, the text included a section called "Are There Disadvantages to Breastfeeding?" And Dr. Spock came up with a couple potential disadvantages, or a couple reasons why maybe mothers might prefer bottle feeding. Now, by 1968, that section had been removed, and there was no more dialogue that suggested that bottle feeding might actually be preferable or a better choice in some instances. But what he did have in the 1968 edition was a specific comparability dialogue that positioned both breastfeeding and formula feeding as within the realm of acceptable choices. And he stated this: if you make the formula carefully and you keep in touch with the doctor, the chances are great that the baby will prosper. This great buildup of importance of nursing is not justified by the facts. Okay, now by the 1990s, that section was also gone, leaving virtually no sections, headings, or even sentences which actually position formula as an acceptable or plausible choice in comparison to breastfeeding. As well, the text does not contain any discussion about what choices are definitely unacceptable or unhealthy for new babies, like, for example, feeding straight cow's milk or just feeding sugar water or something. And because that parameter is missing, the boundary between what might be considered an acceptable choice and what is an unacceptable choice becomes even more difficult to discern. So there is one sentence in the most recent edition that does position these two options in relation to one another, and it's this: formula should only be used when breastfeeding is not an option. So, you know, he is saying there that, yeah, formula is acceptable, but only when breastfeeding is not an option, which of course immediately begs the question, well, when might breastfeeding be deemed not an option for mothers? And the answer to that question depends on which edition you're reading. And that brings me to the second dimension of choice I want to highlight, which is the concept of freedom in choice. And my contention here is that a key element of what determines any particular context of choice is the kind of discursive freedom that people are actually given to consider and weigh the various possibilities or options. And what's happened in the case of infant feeding is that the context of choice has become increasingly less free discursively, right? More and more it's become a directive to breastfeed, no matter what the situation or circumstance. And I'll give you an example here. So, for example, on the issue of breastfeeding and employment, which is a pretty big issue, particularly in the United States, what about the woman who hesitates to nurse because she has to go back to work? Well, in the earlier editions, he said the answer depends on her working hours and how soon she must get back to the job. So he's kind of throwing the ball back in the mother's court and saying, you know, you're really the best person to work that out and decide. By the 1990s, his opinion had changed quite a bit. And now he says, if you've got the determination to succeed and to gain emotional support for your breastfeeding at work and at home, then working and breastfeeding can succeed no matter what your schedule or situation. So this example illustrates really quite well how the text has changed in this regard over the years, right? Increasingly, there are fewer and fewer circumstances or situations in which mothers are given that discursive permission to explore or consider options other than that of breastfeeding, and preferably exclusive breastfeeding, right? In the most recent edition, in fact, Spock advises mothers to use their own judgment in only one instance, and that instance is when mothers have a deep sense of physical discomfort with the actual act of breastfeeding. But even there, the advice to use your own judgment is immediately followed with the statement that it is too, and I quote, "It is too seldom mentioned, however, that after a couple of weeks, breastfeeding becomes definitely pleasurable," which is, of course, highly problematic and, as far as I can tell, not a scientifically grounded statement. All right. Oops, not quite there yet. Oh yeah, the last dimension of choice I want to talk about, and which I think is particularly key to the construction of choice in the arena of intensive mothering, is that of morality. And other people have talked about the concept of morality in intensive mothering, and so suggest that it is a concept that is worth teasing out more and talking about a bit more on a number of different levels. I do want to suggest here that, though, that I think it features very centrally in the arena of choice, particularly with respect to intensive mothering. Now, the economist Etzioni defines a moral act as basically being a situation of non-choice, right? According to Etzioni, if a situation is framed in moral terms, then the correct decision is obvious, and either the person behaves morally or they do not. Further, Etzioni argues that moralized choices are moralized precisely because they call upon more fundamental ideas and values about human behavior and about our world, right? Concerns, ethical concerns about what is right, what is the proper thing to do, the good way to act. Now, I actually disagree with Etzioni's contention that in moralized contexts of choice, the correct decision is obvious. I think the obviousness of choice is shaped more by the criteria I've already talked about, right? The notions of comparability and the freedom or restrictiveness in choice. So in my own thinking on the conceptualization of choice, I'd like to suggest that a context of choice can still be moralized without the correct decision being obvious. And I think that way of thinking might have some implications for the way that we can approach the study of morality and choice in other areas of intensive mothering. Anyway, having said that, I do agree that moralized contexts of choice are those which invoke deeper values and beliefs, and as such create particularly burdened and emotionally charged environments for decision-making and experience. In the case of infant feeding discourse, of course, the broader moralized belief system to which the context of choice is tied is the ideology of intensive mothering. Still have a few minutes? Okay, all right, I'm going to speed up. So what's occurred over the years to the baby and childcare text is that the ideals of intensive mothering, child-centeredness, altruism, and self-sacrifice on the part of the mother, and the ideal of exclusive mothering, for example, have all become increasingly intertwined with the choice of breastfeeding at the same time that they've become increasingly detached from the choice of formula feeding. So through this process, the specific practice of breastfeeding has increasingly become the moral indication of good mothering when it comes to infant feeding. And at the same time, formula feeding has become more and more morally suspect. And this does represent a shift in how the morality of choice in infant feeding was framed in earlier decades. In the earlier editions of the manual, ideas about good mothering were less bound to a particular method of feeding and more tied to the idea that the most important task for mothers was to make the best decision possible, depending on personal circumstance and context. Now, of course, it was still expected that they utilize and incorporate the expert advice they were given, and that expert advice was to breastfeed, but they were given considerably more room to maneuver in their decision-making considerations, right? Success with breastfeeding was not the most important thing, nor was breastfeeding implicitly positioned as a moral indicator of good mothering. In fact, Spock was often very explicit in his earlier editions to challenge this idea head-on. And I just give you a quick example of that, and then I'll wrap up. Yeah, in 1968, he actually said in a couple of instances, wanting to reassure mothers that bottle feeding was in no way a hindrance to their abilities as a good mother and into their abilities to show love and affection and things to their baby. So he says, for example, if when you give him his bottle, you cuddle him in your arms, he'll be nourished spiritually much as if he were at the breast. To put it in other words, there are hundreds of ways in which a mother shows her devotion to her baby and builds his trust in her. He goes on to say breastfeeding is a very good way, and but it's certainly not the only way or necessary way. And then in a comment on bottle propping, he supports, mothers propping some bottles. He says, I agree that there's 100 ways to show affection, to your baby, and no single one is essential in itself. Of course, by the later editions, these portions of text were gone. Spock had explicitly changed his opinion against bottle propping. No longer was that a good thing to do. And also the most recent editions contain sentences and more prominent passages that very explicitly connect breastfeeding with intimacy, and even quite problematically, I would suggest, claim it as a scientifically grounded, that emotional advantages are a main benefit of breastfeeding necessarily. Okay, I was going to talk a little bit about the connection between the context of choice and personal experience, but I don't think we have time, so I won't do that. I'm going to wrap it up with just the comment that the personal experience of choice is very much influenced by these broader discursive forces, right? And in the case of contemporary infant feeding discourse, it's a context of choice that is moralized, discursively restrictive, and which provides little in the way of adequate or truly contextualized comparability. And I think this analysis, I hope, leaves us with the sense of how the very parameters and characteristics of choice are shaped and created discursively through text and through the influence of moral entrepreneurs. And lastly, I just want to say that I hope that this leaves us with the beginnings of some possible tools for which to pursue further study on the issue of choice in intensive mothering culture. For example, by examining the comparability or relative positioning or parameters of various choices and alternatives, by examining the kind of discursive freedom that is provided to mothers in terms of being able to reasonably consider various options, and by examining the particular kinds of moral connections and implications that are being made, we can gain better insight into the inner workings of choice in intensive mothering and into how it operates more generally in mothering discourses and in mothers' everyday experiences.
Thank you very much. Great.